He called me forgetful one last time in probate court, and I almost smiled at the familiarity of it, because by then the word had lost all power over me. Daniel stood beside Melissa in tailored clothes I had helped finance without knowing it, while their attorney argued my canceled payments had caused them hardship, but hardship built on theft has a short life in an American courtroom. George sat beside me, calm as winter, and slid one ledger after another across polished oak until every automatic payment was traced. Mortgage installments on Daniel's investment condo, Melissa's luxury SUV lease, private school tuition for children they had claimed they paid themselves, travel cards, club dues, even a business credit line quietly fed from my widow's account. 42 auto payments. 42 threads in a net they thought would never be seen. When the judge asked Daniel if I had authorized those transfers, he said I had agreed in spirit, and that was the moment his own words buried him. The court ordered restitution in full, with penalties and legal costs. Their claim to my accounts was voided. The power of attorney Daniel had manipulated me into signing was struck down. A financial exploitation referral triggered a state investigation, and within weeks his consulting firm lost 2 contracts after the civil findings became public record. Melissa's name disappeared from the charity board she had loved to parade through. The country club invitations stopped. Their reputation, built on borrowed elegance, folded faster than I ever imagined. But my true victory was not watching them lose. It was reclaiming what was mine. I moved every asset into a protected trust under independent management. I sold nothing in panic. I surrendered nothing in guilt. I rewrote my will, funded scholarships in my late husband's name, and set up a charitable foundation with the very money they had drained for years. Daniel received $1 and a handwritten note sealed with the estate documents. You mistook access for ownership. He read it in silence. He never looked at me the same again. Months later he came to my porch, smaller somehow, asking if we could start over. I told him. Accountability is where starting over begins. Then I closed the door gently. Not in anger. In completion. Sometimes people think revenge is shouting at the dinner table or humiliating someone in public. It is not. Revenge is when those who called you confused must watch you outthink them. Revenge is when the woman they treated like a burden becomes the reason they face consequences. Revenge is canceling 42 payments overnight and exposing an entire fiction by breakfast. The sweetest part came on a Monday morning when I logged into my accounts with fresh coffee beside me and saw every balance restored, every unauthorized draft gone, every safeguard in place. No one monitored my spending. No one questioned my memory. No one spoke to me as if age made me weak. I paid my electric bill myself, mailed a donation to the library, booked a train trip up the New England coast, and laughed alone at the kitchen table, not from bitterness but from relief. For years they made me doubt my mind. In the end, their greed proved my clarity. My son said I was forgetting bills. He was wrong. I was remembering who I was. And when I canceled 42 auto payments overnight, I didn't just stop the theft. I ended their control forever. Mom, you forgot another bill, my son said, reaching across the dinner table for the envelope before I could touch it, and something in the way he smiled made the room go colder than the November rain against the kitchen window. Daniel said it lightly, almost tenderly, as if he were protecting me from embarrassment, but his wife Melissa lowered her eyes too quickly, and I felt that old instinct mothers have when something isn't right begin to stir. I had balanced a household budget for 43 years. I had raised a son, buried a husband, paid off a mortgage, survived recessions, and stretched every social security check like it was made of gold. Forgetting bills was not like forgetting where you put your glasses. It was not me. Yet there sat a red-stamped utility notice on the table, as if it were evidence of my decline. You've had 3 late notices this year, Daniel said, tapping the paper with 2 fingers. I'm worried, Mom. Worried. The word sat between us like a performance. I glanced at the mahogany sideboard where Harold's old brass clock ticked softly, and for a strange moment I heard my late husband's voice in memory saying, "Never sign away what you can still understand." At 68, widowhood had taught me loneliness comes quietly, but betrayal often arrives disguised as concern. Melissa rose to refill coffee and asked if I wanted decaf now because caffeine made older people anxious. Older people. I almost laughed. Instead I looked down at the electric bill. The balance due was $28.40. I had mailed that payment 2 weeks earlier. I was certain of it. Certain enough that a small pulse of unease moved through me. Daniel kept talking about simplifying things, putting accounts under one dashboard, setting up automatic payments so I wouldn't have to remember. We've already helped organize some of it, he said. Already. The word landed harder than the overdue notice. My hand tightened around my coffee mug. I remembered a bank statement from last month I had meant to review more carefully. I remembered seeing withdrawals I assumed were insurance drafts. I remembered dismissing a question because mothers are practiced at explaining away discomfort when it involves their children. But that night, listening to rain beat against the window and my son calmly narrate my supposed forgetfulness, those scattered memories began fitting together with a precision that made my skin prickle. How many bills are on autopay? I asked. Daniel looked almost amused. Quite a few. It's easier this way. Melissa returned and set down pie as if nothing had shifted. I smiled then, the kind of small smile women wear when they do not want the room to know they've just seen through something. I said nothing more through dessert. I let Daniel clear the plates. I let Melissa kiss my cheek at the door. I even let my son remind me not to worry because he was taking care of everything. But after they drove away, I sat alone at my kitchen table under the yellow pool of the overhead light and opened the online banking portal Harold once taught me never to neglect. I scrolled once, twice. Then I stopped breathing for a moment. 42 automatic payments. Some familiar, some impossible. And as the rain kept falling outside, I understood my son had not mistaken me for forgetful. He was counting on me to be. I did not sleep that night. I sat in Harold's old robe at the kitchen table until nearly 3 in the morning, reading each line of those withdrawals as if I were translating a foreign language I should have recognized years ago. The furnace clicked on and off. The refrigerator hummed. Beyond the dark window the rain had stopped, leaving the maple branches silver under the porch light. 42 payments. Some were ordinary enough to hide among the others: utilities, insurance premiums, subscriptions I vaguely remembered. But threaded through them were things that did not belong to my life. A luxury vehicle lease. A commercial phone plan. Mortgage drafts tied to an address I did not know. I copied each one onto a yellow legal pad, my handwriting growing sharper as my confusion hardened into something colder. At dawn I made oatmeal I did not eat and opened old file drawers in the hallway cabinet. For years I had blamed myself for the small humiliations of widowhood, why there was never quite enough left at the end of the month, why I postponed replacing worn tires, why I cut blood pressure pills in half during one bad winter because heating oil had gone up. I had called it fixed income discipline. Now memory began rearranging itself. Daniel insisting I let him streamline my finances after Harold died. Melissa suggesting I switch statements to paperless because printed mail was clutter. That strange afternoon at the bank when Daniel answered a question meant for me before I could speak. Little moments I had treated as kindness now stood up in a line, each one looking different in the light. By noon I drove to town in my old Buick and parked outside Whitmore Savings, the small brick bank Harold trusted for 30 years. The lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and printer toner, unchanged except for younger tellers who no longer knew my name. But George Whitmore was there, older now, shoulders bent, glasses lower on his nose, still carrying the same careful calm. When he saw me, something in his face softened. We sat in his office with the blinds half open and I slid the yellow pad across the desk. He read in silence. No dramatic reaction. Just a long exhale. Then he asked very quietly, "Evelyn, who authorized these linked drafts?" I wanted to say there had been a misunderstanding. Mothers are trained to protect their sons even in private. But I heard myself answer, "I do not think I did." George turned the monitor so I could see. Some withdrawals had been bundled through secondary autopay chains I had never knowingly approved. "This is not ordinary convenience banking," he said. "This is dependency architecture." The phrase chilled me more than accusation would have. It made what I feared sound organized, deliberate. George asked if Daniel had access credentials. I nodded once. He leaned back and folded his hands. "Do not confront him yet." Yet, that word steadied me. For the first time since Harold died, someone was not treating me as fragile. He was treating me as capable. Before leaving, I requested 6 months of statements printed in full. The stack was nearly an inch thick, heavy enough to feel like evidence. Driving home, I passed the grocery where I used to buy Daniel cinnamon rolls when he was 10. I remembered his small hand in mine. I remembered believing love and trust grew from the same root. But by the time I pulled into my driveway, another thought had taken hold. If my son had built a system counting on my silence, then silence might be the sharpest place to begin undoing him. For the next 2 weeks I did exactly what George told me to do. I behaved as if nothing had changed. I answered Daniel's calls in the same warm tone. I let Melissa bring over casseroles and talk about holiday plans as if she were still playing devoted daughter-in-law instead of watching my finances like a second set of eyes. It was astonishing how easily people continue a performance when they believe they are still directing the stage. Every Sunday they came for dinner. Every Sunday I observed more than I spoke. Daniel had a way of checking my kitchen mail before I opened it, casual enough to seem helpful. Unless you were looking for control. Melissa once lifted my prescription bottle and asked whether I had missed doses lately because memory issues can start small. She said it smiling. I smiled back, but inside pieces kept locking into place. George had shown me how several autopay accounts renewed from a shared credentials hub tied to a password Daniel had helped me create after Harold's funeral. The password was my wedding anniversary. Even that intimacy had been used. I began making notes after every visit. Small things. Daniel mentioning rising interest rates while glancing toward me too carefully. Melissa saying they were stretched thin because private school tuition kept going up, though one of those tuition drafts was coming from my account. Their confidence came from habit. They had done this so long they no longer concealed it well. One Thursday Daniel stopped by unannounced with a folder and said we should discuss long-term planning. Words people use when they want authority to sound responsible. He talked about assisted living communities in Arizona where, he said, people my age thrived. My age? I poured him coffee in Harold's old stoneware mug and listened as if considering it. Then I asked a simple question. Daniel, do you still have the condo near Brookhaven? His face changed only for a second, but mothers notice seconds. I sold that years ago, he said too quickly. Yet one of the mortgage drafts on George's printouts was tied to Brookhaven. I nodded as if satisfied. That night I sat in bed with the lamp on, reading statements until nearly midnight, and for the first time anger came, not hot and wild but disciplined. A cleaner emotion. The kind that sharpens rather than burns. The next morning George called. He had traced several drafts routed through a debt consolidation line under Daniel's business entity. He is using your liquidity as a cushion, he said. Such dry words for betrayal. Yet hearing it framed that way gave me clarity. This was not a son making mistakes. This was a system. And systems can be interrupted. We changed nothing yet. That was the point. George advised me to let one full billing cycle pass while we documented everything. So I played older than I was. I misplaced my reading glasses on purpose. I asked Melissa to repeat herself. I let Daniel explain online banking as though I were learning it for the first time. Once he patted my shoulder and said, "Do not worry, Mom. I have everything under control." I nearly laughed at the irony, because by then I had begun memorizing due dates, creditor names, routing numbers. 42 pressure points. 42 places where a single night could change everything. And as December crept in and Christmas lights appeared along our street, I realized my son believed he was managing a forgetful widow. He had not yet imagined he was being studied. The first snow came the week George called and said he had found something neither of us expected. Several of the automatic drafts were not simply paying Daniel's obligations. They were sustaining balances already in arrears. My money had not only been cushioning his life, it had been quietly preventing it from cracking. I stood at the kitchen sink listening while flakes drifted past the window, soft and innocent against a sky the color of pewter, and George said in his calm way, "Pressure creates mistakes." I understood what he meant before he explained. If the payment stopped suddenly, the panic would reveal more than confrontation ever could. That was when our plan changed from defense to design. I began visiting the bank every Tuesday under the pretense of learning online security. George showed me how to separate primary accounts, how to move reserves into a protected trust shell without triggering notice, how to prepare revocations for digital authorizations. Dry legal steps, almost boring in their precision, yet I felt stronger with every form I signed. One afternoon he asked whether I wanted to notify Daniel before taking action. I looked at Harold's wedding ring on my hand and said no. Let truth arrive to him the way deception had arrived to me, quietly. At home I continued my part. Melissa invited me to a holiday luncheon at the country club, and spent most of the meal dropping hints about a ski trip they hoped to take after New Year's. I nodded while knowing part of its funding sat hidden in those 42 drafts. Then she said something careless. Daniel worries what will happen if you cannot manage much longer. Cannot manage. The words should have wounded me. Instead they clarified everything. They had already built a future in which I was diminished. They were counting on my surrender as part of their planning. That evening I pulled old family albums from the closet, perhaps to remind myself Daniel had once been a boy who brought me dandelions and sticky fists. But even memory had changed shape. Love does not excuse exploitation. It only makes recognizing it take longer. 2 days before Christmas Daniel came over with expensive chocolates and an exaggerated gentleness that now looked almost theatrical. He offered to handle year-end taxes for me. He asked for my laptop. He asked whether I still remembered the security answers. I pretended uncertainty and watched relief pass over his face like sunlight. He believed my confusion was deepening. That belief became my cover. The following Monday George slid a folder across his desk stamped with tabs. Every linked creditor. Every cancellation protocol. Every sequence time so no alert would fire until the chain reaction had already begun. One night, he said. Do them all. I took the folder home and placed it in Harold's old recipe box, of all places, between handwritten pie crust cards and Thanksgiving stuffing notes. Strange where revolutions rest. In the days that followed I moved through ordinary rituals with heightened attention, buying oranges, mailing Christmas cards, dusting the mantle, while beneath those domestic motions something immense gathered. It was not rage. It was resolve. On New Year's Eve Daniel called to say he was proud I seemed less anxious lately. I thanked him and wished him a happy new year. After midnight fireworks popped faintly across town while I sat in my robe at the kitchen table, folder open, pen ready, creditor numbers lined before me like a row of doors. 42 places to knock. 42 threads to cut. And as the clock turned past 1 in the morning, I reached for the first authorization code and realized I was no longer preparing to survive what they had done. I was preparing to end it. At 1:12 in the morning I made the first call. A woman in Arizona with a tired but kind voice verified my identity, read back the linked draft authorization, and canceled it while I listened to computer keys clicking in the silence of my kitchen. I thanked her, hung up, and crossed out the first line on George's list. 41 remained. By 3:30 every automatic payment was gone. Mortgage drafts suspended. Credit lines disconnected from my account. Tuition withdrawals revoked. Luxury lease autopays terminated. The final cancellation was for a club membership I had never once stepped inside. When I placed the phone down my hands trembled. Not from fear but from the release of carrying something too heavy for too long. Outside the neighborhood was still. Snow reflected moonlight across the yard, making everything look brighter than night should allow. I slept 2 hours and woke before dawn to make coffee. At 7:43 the first call came. Daniel. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice had a strain I had never heard. Mom, are you having banking issues? I looked out at cardinals hopping near the feeder, and said I was not aware of any issues. He said one of his accounts had rejected a payment by mistake. I said machines do make mistakes. Silence. Then he asked whether I had touched any automatic drafts. Touched was such an interesting word, as though my own money belonged to someone delicate and untouchable. I told him I had been reviewing household expenses. He arrived within 40 minutes, coat half button, Melissa behind him pale beneath careful makeup. They had not come to check on me. They had come to stop a leak. Daniel moved through the kitchen with forced composure, asking whether I had spoken to anyone at the bank. Melissa claimed creditors had made an error affecting many people. It might have sounded convincing if I had not watched her hand shake when she lifted a coffee cup. I said very little. I wanted panic to reveal its own shape. Then Daniel's phone buzzed. He glanced down and all color left his face. Another payment failure. Then another. His whole posture changed. For years I had seen him as my son's first successful professional second. In that moment I saw a man whose confidence depended on hidden supports now collapsing one alert at a time. He tried authority next. He said canceling linked payments could damage credit, contracts, obligations I did not understand. I asked quietly which of those obligations were mine. Neither answered. Melissa began to cry, not dramatically, but with the thin panic of someone realizing a private arrangement has become visible. After they left, George called and said several creditors had already reached out to Daniel's office. Pressure creates mistakes, he repeated. He was right. By afternoon Daniel had sent 6 text messages, each more urgent than the last. Explanations. Appeals. A suggestion we meet privately before outsiders got involved. Outsiders. As though truth itself were an intruder. I did not reply. Instead I spread the 6 months of statements across my dining room table and began marking every transfer tied to personal benefit. By evening a certified letter was prepared requesting restitution review and revoking all residual permissions. The strange thing was how calm I felt. No triumph. No fury. Just order returning. For years money had leaked from my life so quietly I mistook depletion for aging. In one night the leak had stopped. But more than that, something inside me had reversed. They had expected confusion, guilt, perhaps apology. What they found was documentation. And as dusk settled over the snow and my porch light clicked on, I understood the cancellations had not been the retaliation. They were only the opening move. 3 days after the cancellations Daniel asked to meet at a diner halfway between our homes, the kind with cracked red booths and coffee that tasted burned no matter how fresh it was. He chose the place, perhaps thinking public space would soften me. I arrived early and took a booth near the window where snowmelt ran in thin gray streams along the curb. When he came in he looked older, not in years but in strain. His tie was crooked. His smile arrived late. Melissa did not come. That told me more than if she had. Daniel began with wounded confusion. He said, there had been misunderstandings, bookkeeping overlaps, temporary uses of funds he had meant to reconcile. Interesting how theft becomes overlap when spoken gently enough. I listened without interruption. Harold used to say let people talk long enough and they will confess through euphemism. Daniel did. He admitted using my account links during a difficult season in his business. He framed it as family borrowing. He said he protected me from financial stress. Then he made his mistake. He asked whether I would restore some of the payments temporarily, so he could stabilize exposure. Not apologize. Stabilize exposure. A businessman's plea wrapped in filial language. I set my coffee cup down and slid a folded packet across the table. Copies of transfers highlighted in yellow. Mortgage drafts. Tuition. Club dues. A personal travel card used in Aspen. He stared as if paper itself had betrayed him. You tracked all this? He asked. I almost answered the question hidden beneath his words. You were not supposed to notice. Instead I said, I paid attention. He reached for my hand then, perhaps from instinct, perhaps strategy, but I kept mine folded. He lowered his voice and said if these records became formal it could damage his reputation. There it was. Not sorrow for what he had done. Fear of consequence. I told him a restitution proposal had already been prepared through counsel. His face hardened. For the first time irritation slipped through. He asked whether George had put ideas in my head. As though dignity were contagion. I stood to leave and Daniel said something meant to wound. You are letting outsiders come between family. I turned and heard myself answer with a calm I had not rehearsed. No, Daniel. What came between family was what you withdrew while I trusted you. I left money for my pie untouched and walked out into the cold with a steadiness that surprised me. That evening Melissa called in tears, saying Daniel was under pressure, that creditors were threatening defaults, that I did not understand what public exposure could do. I understood perfectly. Actions create exposure. I simply said all communication should go through counsel. When I hung up I sat by the living room lamp with George's latest documents. He had expanded the review and found one more layer. Reimbursement transfers routed through Daniel's company as consulting expenses. That discovery shifted everything from family betrayal toward legal misrepresentation. George did not dramatize it. He merely adjusted his glasses and said, now they have something to lose beyond convenience. In the following days, Daniel's messages changed tone again. Less pleading, more defensive. He hinted I was overreacting, that age made people suspicious. That old weapon, memory. But it no longer landed. I spent the week meeting an estate attorney, restructuring beneficiary instructions, revoking emergency authority forms, and transferring title protections on the house. Each signature felt like reclaiming acreage inside myself. On Friday, George called to say Daniel's business lender had requested explanations after payment interruptions triggered review. The system was reacting on its own now. I did not have to push. Truth was moving. That night I opened Harold's cedar box of letters and reread one he wrote me at 30, saying strength is rarely loud when it matters. I touched the paper and understood at last. The diner meeting had not been reconciliation. It had been Daniel's last attempt to keep the old arrangement breathing. And when I walked out without yielding, something final had already begun. By late January, the matter had moved beyond family argument and into procedure, which was exactly where deceit weakens. The attorney George recommended was a woman named Linda Mercer, who wore plain navy suits and spoke with the kind of precision that made emotional manipulation sound embarrassingly amateur. In her office she reviewed the transfer records, Daniel's admissions at the diner, the linked reimbursement trails, and then looked at me over her glasses and asked a question no one had asked before. "Mrs. Carter, do you want restoration, accountability, or protection?" I realized they were not the same. I told her I wanted all three. That was the day formal demand letters went out. Not dramatic accusations. Just documented claims for restitution, notice of revoked authority, and a warning that further use of my financial identity would trigger civil action. Quiet instruments. Sharp ones. Daniel responded through his own attorney within 48 hours, denying intent while offering partial repayment framed as family settlement. Linda smiled when she read it. People offer partial repayment when full exposure frightens them. I had begun to understand that truth in legal language has a way of stripping sentiment from betrayal. Around that same time something unexpected happened. 2 women from my church quilting group stopped by with soup after hearing, in that small-town way information travels, that I had some trouble with finances. I almost corrected the phrase. Trouble had made it sound mutual. But as we sat at my kitchen table I realized something else had shifted. I was no longer protecting Daniel's image from the world. For years mothers of my generation were taught silence preserved family dignity. Yet silence had preserved only his access. So when one of the women gently asked if my son had taken advantage of me, I said yes. The word left my mouth like a door opening. It carried no shame. A week later Daniel appeared at Sunday dinner uninvited. I had roasted chicken for one and was surprised how little my pulse changed seeing him on the porch. He came in softer than before, almost rehearsed in humility. He said lenders were asking questions. A board position Melissa held was under review. He said if I pursued formal findings it could destroy what he had built. I listened and served him chicken as if he were still a boy home from college. Then he asked whether I would withdraw the exploitation referral Linda had initiated. There it was again. Not remorse but fear dressed as reconciliation. I told him referrals are not withdrawn by wounded mothers over supper. They proceed or they do not. He stared at me for a long moment and said, "You would really do this to your own son?" I folded my napkin and answered, "No, Daniel. I am finally responding to what my son did to me." He left before dessert untouched. Afterward I washed dishes slowly and felt no triumph, only a deep settling. The following Thursday, George called with news that Daniel's consulting firm had been asked by a major client to certify there were no unresolved financial integrity claims involving principals. A bureaucratic sentence, almost dull. Yet it hit harder than accusation. Consequence had reached reputation. Melissa called once more, voice brittle, saying people were talking at the club. I thought of the dues my account had paid there and nearly smiled. Let them talk. Linda then proposed one final strategic move, petitioning for formal accounting under court supervision rather than private settlement. Public record. Transparency. Sunlight. I signed without hesitation. That night, snowmelt dripped from the eaves and I sat in Harold's chair reading the petition before mailing. The woman who months earlier doubted her own memory now understood routing codes, fiduciary duties, revocation clauses. Strange what betrayal teaches. But the deeper lesson was this: power returns not in one grand moment, but in 100 quiet refusals to be managed. And as I sealed the envelope, I sensed the next phase would no longer be about proving what Daniel had done. It would be about watching what truth cost him. The court petition was filed on a Tuesday, and by Friday the first cracks became visible in places Daniel once believed untouchable. Linda called that morning while I was trimming dead stems in the winter garden. Her voice carried no excitement, only measured fact. Daniel's counsel had requested emergency settlement talks after the accounting petition triggered discovery exposure. I set down the shears and looked out over the dormant rose beds Harold planted years ago, thinking how roots survive winters by going still. There was a hearing 2 weeks later in a county courtroom with low ceilings and fluorescent lights that hummed faintly over oak benches polished by decades of restless hands. It was not grand, not cinematic, just administrative in appearance, which made what unfolded there feel even sharper. Daniel arrived with his attorney, Melissa beside him in cream wool, face composed but drawn tight around the mouth. I noticed she no longer wore the diamond bracelet my money had once helped pay for. Small things speak. Under questioning, Daniel tried the language he had used from the beginning: family assistance, misunderstandings, shared benefit. But discovery records had no patience for euphemism. Linda introduced link transfer logs, creditor records, reimbursement coding through Daniel's firm, and most damaging of all, correspondence showing he had described my accounts internally as a liquidity backstop. I watched the phrase land in the room like something metallic. Not son helping mother. Asset being used. The judge ordered a supervised forensic accounting and froze any remaining disputed channels pending review. It was not final judgment, but it was public procedure, and public procedure leaves footprints. By Monday, a local business paper ran a short notice about compliance questions involving Daniel's firm after court disclosures. No scandal headline, just enough truth in print to unsettle investors and board members. George later told me 2 clients had paused renewals. Melissa's charity gala invitation was rescinded the same week, quietly, through what she called a scheduling adjustment when she phoned in tears. I remember listening without cruelty. Consequence does not need witnesses to be real. Then came the moment that changed the emotional center of everything. Daniel asked to meet at my house alone. He stood in the living room beneath Harold's landscape painting, and for the first time since this began he did not defend himself. He looked exhausted, shoulders lowered as if some scaffolding had come off. He said he had spent years believing he was only borrowing against what would someday be his anyway. The entitlement in that sentence was almost more revealing than all the ledgers. I asked whether he ever considered what it meant for me to ration medication while funding his comfort. He covered his face with one hand and said nothing. Silence can be confession too. He offered to resign from the firm, liquidate the condo, repay everything if I would stop the accounting review. Months earlier I might have mistaken that for remorse. Now I recognized negotiation. I told him repayment discussions would continue through counsel and the review would proceed. He looked at me as if seeing someone unfamiliar. Perhaps he was. After he left, I sat at the piano no one had touched since Harold died and pressed a few hesitant notes. The house sounded less lonely. A week later the forensic report arrived. It documented unauthorized benefit flows beyond even George's estimate. More than money, it established pattern. Intent. That word mattered. Linda said softly, "This is the pivot." She was right. Up until then Daniel still imagined damage could be managed. But once intent entered the record, the story was no longer about family conflict. It was about accountability. And as March sunlight began thawing the edges of the yard, I understood the next stage would not be defending my dignity. It would be watching the structure he built around deception begin collapsing under the weight of documented truth. Spring arrived early that year, crocuses pushing through thawed soil beside the walkway as if the earth itself had decided to start over. And with spring came the unraveling Daniel had feared more than judgment. The forensic accounting report did not merely support my claims, it widened them. Linda called me into her office and spread the findings across a conference table. Unauthorized benefit streams, concealed routing patterns, reimbursement misclassifications, all written in dry accounting language that somehow made betrayal feel even starker. There was no melodrama in columns of figures. Only fact. The report triggered restitution proceedings, and a referral for regulatory review involving Daniel's firm. Word traveled fast in circles where reputation passes for currency. George told me one board had asked Daniel to step aside pending resolution. Another client had terminated a contract quietly. Quietly seemed to be how empires faded. Then came the Sunday dinner I had not expected would matter, the one Linda later called the moral hearing before the legal one. Daniel asked if he and Melissa could come over. I set the dining table with the good china I had once saved for holidays, and when they arrived I saw strain had altered them. Melissa, who once spoke in polished certainties, barely touched her food. Daniel stared at the roast as though it required courage. Halfway through dinner he said they were selling the Brookhaven condo, the one he claimed years ago to have sold already. The lie folded in on itself so naturally I almost pitied him. Almost. Then Melissa surprised me. She reached into her purse and placed a folder beside my plate. Statements, apology drafts, a proposed repayment schedule. She said she had prepared herself. Her voice trembled when she admitted she had known more than she had allowed herself to name. Not all at once, she said, but enough. I believed tears would move me once. Instead, what moved me was her finally speaking plainly. Daniel interrupted, saying they could repair this privately if I stopped the court from issuing final findings. There it was again, salvage. Always salvage. I rose, walked to the hallway cabinet, and brought back a thin envelope. Inside was a copy of my revised estate plan. Not to threaten, to clarify. I handed it to Daniel. He scanned the provisions and went still. Independent trust management. Revoked inheritance assumptions. A charitable foundation funded ahead of residual distributions. He looked up and whispered, almost boyish for a moment. You changed everything. I answered, no. I finally saw everything. The silence after that felt honest in a way our family had not known in years. A week later the court entered preliminary restitution terms and authorized recovery with penalties. It was not dramatic punishment. It was worse for those who rely on image. It was documented accountability. Daniel's firm issued a governance statement. Melissa resigned from 2 social committees before being asked. People who once praised their success now spoke in lowered voices. I did not chase any of it. I planted tomatoes in raised beds and mailed scholarship paperwork in Harold's name. But the true turning point came when Daniel called one evening, not to negotiate, not to defend, but to say he had moved into a rental after selling assets to meet obligations. His voice sounded stripped of polish. He asked if I hated him. I stood at the kitchen sink rinsing strawberries and said hate belongs to people still controlled by injury. I am not controlled anymore. After we hung up I realized something subtle but immense. For months the story had been about what they took. Now it had become about what I had rebuilt. Yet Linda warned one last hearing remained. The final accounting approval where findings would enter permanent record. That is where masks come off, she said. And as I folded the dish towel and looked at evening light spilling gold across Harold's old clock, I knew the last mask had not yet fallen. The final hearing took place on a bright April morning when dogwoods were beginning to bloom along the courthouse lawn. The kind of soft southern spring day that makes ordinary places look almost forgiving. Inside, nothing felt forgiving. The courtroom was fuller than before, not with spectators hungry for drama, but with attorneys, clerks, and 2 regulatory observers whose quiet presence made the room feel sharper. Linda had warned me permanent findings carry a gravity settlement talks never do. She was right. When Daniel entered, he did not carry the practiced confidence he once wore like cologne. Even the way he set his briefcase down seemed careful, as though too much had become fragile. Melissa sat behind him, hands folded tightly in her lap. George leaned toward me before proceedings began and whispered, "Today facts stop being allegations." I held on to that. The accounting findings were read into the record line by line, each unauthorized benefit stream described with almost unbearable calm. Mortgage support, personal debt servicing, tuition subsidies, business liquidity support. Hearing my life translated into categories of misuse should have humiliated me. Instead it steadied me, because truth sounded larger when spoken publicly. Then came the moment I had not expected. Daniel's counsel attempted one final argument that the transfers reflected implied family consent, and before Linda could rise, the judge asked Daniel directly whether he had ever disclosed to me the full scope of those linked payments. Silence. Long enough for everyone to feel it. Daniel looked down, then said no. One syllable. Barely louder than breath. Yet it seemed to alter the air. The judge's expression did not change, but the ruling that followed carried a finality I felt in my bones. Full restitution with penalties. Recovery costs assigned. The misuse findings entered permanent record. The exploitation referral sustained. No raised voices. No gavel theatrics. Just consequence written where it could not be charmed away. Afterward in the corridor, Daniel caught up to me near a stone column and asked if there was any version of this where he could still be my son. Strange question after all that had passed. I looked at the man before me, older now than when this began, diminished less by money lost than by illusions stripped away. I told him being my son was never what was on trial. Character was. He wept then, quietly, with the shame of someone hearing his own life summarized accurately for the first time. I did not comfort him. Some grief belongs to accountability. Weeks later the practical consequences deepened. Daniel stepped down from his firm under governance pressure. Melissa's social standing, once so carefully curated, thinned almost overnight. The Brookhaven condo sold. Assets were liquidated. Restitution payments began arriving through court channels each month. Each deposit a strange little monument to reality restored. Yet the deepest satisfaction was not their losses. It was what rose in their place. I funded the Harold Carter Community Scholarship ahead of schedule. I updated my trust with protections so no future help could ever become hidden control. I took a train up the New England coast in May, watching salt marshes flash silver beyond the window, and for the first time in years I felt no one was quietly feeding off the edges of my life. Then one Sunday after church, a woman I barely knew touched my arm and said she had heard I stood up for myself in a way many older women never do. I carried that home more carefully than any legal victory. Because she was right. This had never only been about money. It was about refusing erasure. That night I sat at Harold's old desk and reread the note I had placed in my estate papers for Daniel. You mistook access for ownership. It seemed truer now than when I wrote it. Linda called the next morning and said all that remained was closing compliance, mostly formalities. Mostly. But she paused and added, almost amused, there is one last surprise in the restitution audit you may want to see. And from her tone alone I knew the story was not done giving back. Linda's surprise turned out to be buried in a compliance appendix no ordinary person would have read to the final pages. There had been a residual escrow reserve attached to one of the debt facilities Daniel had serviced through my funds, money oversecured and forgotten because no one expected the account structure to be unraveled this deeply. With penalties and reconciliations applied, a portion of that reserve was ordered returned to me. It was not a fortune, but it was enough to feel poetic, as if the machinery built to drain me had coughed something back up. Linda smiled when she explained it and said, sometimes fraud leaves breadcrumbs even greed overlooks. I took the check home and laid it beside Harold's old fountain pen for a long while before depositing it. Not because of the amount, because of what it represented. Recovery beyond survival. I used part of it to fully endow the scholarship fund, but the decision that startled everyone came next. I amended my estate once more, not to disinherit Daniel further, but to remove inheritance as the central moral drama entirely. Most of the estate would now flow into the foundation and designated family trusts for future grandchildren, under independent oversight. Daniel received a modest personal provision contingent on completing restitution and financial ethics counseling, Linda's idea, which I accepted because accountability without a path forward can become only punishment. When Daniel learned of it, he called in disbelief. You are giving more to strangers than to your own son. I answered. I am giving where stewardship is honored. He said nothing for a long while. Then very quietly, I do not know how to come back from what I did. For once there was no strategy in his voice. Just weariness. I told him coming back begins where entitlement ends. In early summer he asked if he could help me repaint the porch. We spent a Saturday scraping old white rails under a hot June sun, saying little. At one point he stopped and said he had sold the last luxury car, moved to a smaller rental, and taken a compliance role instead of rebuilding his old firm. People look at me differently now, he said. I kept brushing paint and replied, sometimes that is how we finally see ourselves. It was not forgiveness in a cinematic sense. It was something quieter, perhaps truer. Meanwhile, Melissa faded from my life almost entirely except for one letter, handwritten, apologizing not only for what she took part in but for every time she used age itself as a way to diminish me. I folded the letter into Harold's cedar box. Some apologies do not restore trust, but they deserve witness. Then came the final irony. A regional paper did a feature on elder financial exploitation prevention and asked to quote me anonymously. I agreed. George laughed when he read the line they used. Control often hides behind the language of help. He said I had become dangerous in the best possible way. Perhaps he was right. The woman who once worried over $28.40 on a utility notice was now advising church widows to check linked accounts and never surrender passwords without oversight. The shame had changed addresses. It no longer lived with me. By late July, the final restitution installment cleared. Every unauthorized dollar had been accounted for through repayment, recovery, or offset. Linda sent a one-page closing letter stating all compliance conditions were satisfied and no further actions remained pending. Such plain words for the end of a war fought mostly in silence. That evening Daniel came by with groceries and almost awkwardly asked if I still kept Harold's old chess set. We played until dusk. I beat him in 21 moves. He laughed for the first time in months. As he packed up, he glanced at the bank statements framed in a folder on my desk and said, half to himself, I really thought you were slipping. I looked at him and felt the final line of this story form with complete calm. No, I said. I was waking up. And in that moment I knew the ending would not be written in court orders or penalties, but in the fact that the woman they once tried to manage now stood entirely beyond management. Autumn came with a clarity I had not noticed in years, the maple outside my kitchen window turning copper while morning light fell across ledgers now closed for good. There were no more hearings, no more letters marked urgent, no more hidden drafts feeding another household from my own. The final compliance record had settled into public archive, permanent and plain, and with it Daniel's old professional persona had ended in a way no charm could restore. His former firm merged without him. His name was removed from the founding materials. Regulatory disclosures followed him into every serious financial conversation after that. Not prison, not spectacle, something far more enduring for a man who had lived by reputation. Documented loss of trust. Melissa's social world, once polished to a shine, thinned to almost nothing. Invitations stopped. Committees moved on. Even the country club membership that had once drawn money from my account was surrendered under financial pressure and embarrassment. They paid in dollars in standing in the quiet humiliations people feel when a false life is forced into daylight. But I had long stopped measuring justice by what they lost. Justice was what I had regained. One October afternoon I hosted the first Harold Carter Scholarship Luncheon in the town library auditorium, a modest room with folding chairs and coffee urns, nothing grand, yet fuller of dignity than any place where my money had once been siphoned away. 2 students received awards. Their parents shook my hand. George sat in the front row grinning like a man who had watched a private revolution become civic fact. During the remarks I heard myself say something I had not planned. Independence is not something age takes from us. It is something people sometimes try to take, and we have the right to refuse. The room grew still. Afterwards 3 widows stayed behind to ask how to check linked accounts. We spread papers across a library table and I showed them what to look for. In that moment I realized the story had moved beyond me. What began as betrayal had become warning, and warning had become protection for others. Months later Daniel came for Christmas dinner carrying a pie from the bakery I used to take him to as a boy. We ate by candlelight under Harold's old clock, and for once no one performed. After dinner he handed me a small envelope. Inside was a copy of the last restitution confirmation signed by him, with a note in his handwriting. I confused your love with permission. I was wrong. I folded it carefully and put it beside Melissa's apology in the cedar box. Then I gave him something in return, not money, not absolution, but a framed copy of the scholarship charter bearing Harold's name. This, I said, is where what was taken ended up. He stared at it for a long time, then nodded in a way I had not seen since he was young. The deepest payoff came a week later at the bank. I stood at the same counter where months before I had arrived frightened and uncertain. This time the manager greeted me by name and slid over updated trust statements showing every asset secured, every safeguard active, every authority resting solely where I chose. I signed one final form and George, now preparing to retire, said with quiet pride, "Mrs. Carter, no one controls your accounts but you." Such a simple sentence. Yet it felt larger than the courtroom ruling. I walked out into cold January sun carrying no file folders, no evidence packets, no burden except the ordinary groceries I had stopped to buy. And standing by my car, I laughed aloud, remembering the first overdue notice laid on my table like proof I was fading. They tried to make forgetfulness my weakness. It became their undoing. Because the woman they called confused canceled the machinery feeding their deception, exposed every hidden withdrawal, reclaimed every dollar that could be reclaimed, redirected her estate beyond their grasp, and forced those who used her to answer in public record. That is not survival. That is victory. That night Daniel helped me bring in firewood, and as we stacked logs by the hearth he said softly, almost ashamed of the memory, "I used to think I was managing you." I looked at the flames catching and answered with more peace than anger, "You were living off what you never owned." He lowered his eyes and accepted it. No argument. No defense. Only truth. Later, after he left, I sat alone with tea, opened my banking portal out of habit, and saw balances resting exactly where they should, untouched except by me. I paid the electric bill myself, smiled at the absurdity of how it all began, and turned off the lamp. There was no loose thread left. The theft was exposed. The consequences were real. My name was clear. My control absolute. And in the quiet of that winter house I understood the most satisfying revenge was not watching them fall. It was knowing they would spend the rest of their lives remembering the moment they mistook an older woman's trust for weakness, and how wrong they were.